Okay, and it looks like we are about 2 after the hour, so we can begin. Hello and welcome everyone to our January MMS info session. These sessions are offered under the CMS Measures Management System contract led by Patel. I am Kate Buchanan and I'm joined by my colleague Brenna Rabel, and today's session will be on terminology and measure specification. So if we move on to the next slide. So here you can see a little bit about MMS and what we have to offer. Stakeholder engagement is, info sessions are one component of stakeholder engagement. And before I hand it over to Brenna, I do want to review a couple of housekeeping items. First, today's session is being recorded. Second, all participants will be muted during the call. We will have an opportunity for Q&A. To ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the window. So you should see it should be next to the chat function. Third, we will share resources throughout the webinar in the chat window. So you should see a download to the slides right there right now. So if you click on the chat, you should be able to see the slides, but in order to ask questions, you do have to click on the Q&A function. Finally, the presentation slides from today's session have been posted to the MMS Hub website for your reference, and the recording of today's presentations will be posted to the CMS YouTube page at a later date. So with that, I will hand it over to Brenna.
Great, thanks, Kate. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Perfect. Let's go to the next slide. So hello, everybody. Today's discussion is a bit of a mixed bag. We're going to start with an overview of the steps that comprise measure specification as it's defined in the blueprint on the MMS Hub. And then I'm going to go through some common measurement terms and their definitions, as well as some discussion of the importance of standard definitions in measurement, with hopefully plenty of time for Q&A. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So before we dive in to the details of this discussion, as usual, I would like to anchor us in the measure lifecycle. So on this side, you see the measure lifecycle graphic as it's described in the blueprint. And as shown, this lifecycle is an iterative process that begins with measure conceptualization, which is where measure developers do initial information gathering to identify high priority topics that are both important to patients and suitable to performance measurement. So the natural next step from that phase is measure specification, which is, of course, where we're going to spend most of our time today. Specification is when measure developers begin to flesh out their initial measure concepts into testable measure specifications. And this includes mapping how the measure may be defined and calculated, determining the measure's data source or sources, defining key data elements, thinking through measure exclusions, and mapping the measure algorithm. This is also when developers can begin thinking through the types of questions about the measure that will need to be answered in subsequent testing. Measure testing then involves the collection of quantitative and qualitative data to establish whether the measure meets its evaluation criteria. And to do that, measure developers often work with test sites, such as hospitals or clinicians' offices, to see how their draft measures would fare in a real-world environment. And then if a measure shows promise after measure testing and final specification, then measure developers may submit their measures for use in federal programs. In the case of CMS measures, this often involves submission to the measures under consideration list, or the MUC list, for pre-rulemaking and rulemaking review. And then assuming that a measure makes it through rulemaking, it moves into the measure use, continuing evaluation, and maintenance phase. Once a measure is adopted for use in a program, it undergoes annual evaluation to ensure that it complies with up-to-date clinical guidelines, and then triennial comprehensive reevaluations to ensure that the measure is still effective and necessary for use. Next slide. So the goal of measure specification, as I said, is to create detailed, clear, rigorous, and precise technical specifications that are harmonized with existing measures. Technical specifications, sort of at its most basic, are instructions for how to build and calculate a measure. The intent of the measure specification is that each measure should reach its appropriate target population, but not overreach or underreach. Errors in specification, especially at that target population level, is not only has the potential to waste resources, but may also generate misleading conclusions about care quality, which we always want to avoid. The measure specification stage consists of both technical specification writing as well as harmonization, along with stakeholder engagement through things like public comment and technical expert panels. And then as a result of those activities, final technical specifications should provide comprehensive details that allow collection of measure data and implementation of the measure in a way that is consistent, reliable, and effective. And we're going to talk about all of that a little bit more on the next slide, which we can go to. So developing technical specifications is an iterative process, and I want to spend a few minutes here talking about that in some detail. So when specifying a measure, the measure developer has to consider the data source and the data elements necessary for the proposed measure, and has to conduct preliminary feasibility assessments to determine the extent to which those data elements are available in whichever data source or sources are being used for measurement. And as part of that endeavor, developers may request preliminary input from standards subject matter experts regarding the data model, terminology, data elements, clinical quality language or CQL expression, and potential impacts on clinician workflows. Doing that provides important information about how key data are likely to be stored and coded, which in turn can inform feasibility and potential implementation challenges down the line. In drafting the initial specifications at this stage, measure developers will likely start with things like a high-level numerator and denominator statement, and then some initial information on potential denominator and numerator exclusions where applicable. And then the measure developer gives the measure increasing amounts of detail, including precisely defined data elements and the appropriate values or value sets. But it's really important to note that every part of the measure specification requires explicitly defined elements and then the relationships between those elements. Again, within that goal, measure developers must explicitly identify the types of data and how to aggregate or link these data so the calculation of the measure is reliable and valid. This is sometimes referred to as constructing the data protocol. So it's important to proceed carefully when merging data from different sources or systems to prevent errors. So when merging data from multiple sources, it can be difficult to readily identify duplicate data, to reconcile different units of measurement used in each data source, or to account for variations in quality controls used across data sources. So a good data protocol will include details for how to mitigate those inconsistencies to make sure that the measure is being derived from sort of a similar baseline of data sets. Finally, measure developers also have to consider the appropriate attribution model at this phase, which is essentially just the determination of who will be assigned responsibility for measure performance. So the attribution model can affect which patients to include in the population addressed by something like a value-based purchasing program, or those patients that are included in the denominator of a quality measure. A TEP and possibly other stakeholders such as work groups, subject matter experts, and other developers may review and suggest changes to your specifications at this phase, and then again throughout the measure lifecycle. And then finally, before we move on, I'll just mention that technical specifications and their requirements may vary for certain special measure types. ECQMs in particular differ slightly in their execution. And so as such, we always recommend visiting the MMS Hub for more information about those. Next slide. So to achieve their intended purpose, quality measures must be calculated the same way, using the same information across entities every time. And that's why the measure specification phase is so crucial and dependent on information from testing to get it right. So needless to say, Clear and consistent definitions, both within technical specifications and in communications among stakeholders about those specifications, is essential. Next slide, please. So even outside of technical specifications, there are some terms used in measurement that may be a source of confusion across measure developers and other stakeholders. So I'm going to spend some time over the next few minutes going through a very non-exhaustive list of terms and definitions, but I would encourage folks to let us know via the Q&A feature if there are other terms that you'd like us to define here or explore in future presentations. But for today, we're mostly going to be focusing on topics that are listed here. So patient-reported terminology, levels of analysis, and accountable entities, distinctions between exceptions and exclusions, and then, of course, a little bit of language around digital quality measures. And so for each of these terms, I'm going to be explaining why sort of a thorough understanding of those definitions is essential to measurement and where people kind of go wrong. Next slide, please. So again, although this presentation isn't focused specifically on patient-reported measures, there is a great deal of patient-related terminology that gets thrown around that can be a source of confusion among stakeholders. So we'll just take a few minutes to walk through some of that now. Next slide. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, CMS's National Quality Strategy takes a person-centered approach to quality and safety, and the notion of person-centered care is embedded in all aspects of the measure development process. So as such, there is a lot of related vocabulary swirling around that's very easy to conflate. So I'm going to go into detail about how terms like patient-reported outcomes, patient-reported outcome measures, and patient-reported outcomes-based performance measures relate to one another, as well as how those terms differ from things like patient-reported data in general and then patient-level testing. Next slide. So we've shared a slide like this in the past in some of our patient-reported outcomes related presentations, but I think it's it's worth repeating here. So just the distinction here is that a patient-reported outcome or a PRO is broad. It's just any information on a person's healthcare that comes directly from that person. And so that can include qualitative information that a person shares with their healthcare provider, or it can even be as straightforward as a response about pain on a scale of 1 to 10, for example, or really any other information about a condition that comes directly from a patient. So then going down a level, the patient-reported outcome measure, or PROM, refers to any instrument, scale, or single item measure that's used to assess the patient-reported outcome. So a good example of this is the WHO's, the Hip Injury and Osteoarthritis Outcome Score, which is a tool to gather information about functional status among patients who have undergone, for example, a hip replacement. And then finally, a patient-reported outcome-based performance measure, or a PRO-PM, is another level of abstraction down. So that refers to the actual performance measure that's based on that PROM data. So to create a PRO-PM, measure developers have to ensure that both the data collection tool and the subsequent performance measure have been validated for use in quality measurement. And so there are quality measures that are actually based on that WHO's tool that I referenced for the PROM. Next slide. The important distinction between patient-reported data and any other type of patient data is that, by definition, it must be reported directly by the patient or a representative to their care teams. It can be collected via any number of avenues, including during discussions in person or over the phone with their care team. It could be collected via paper-based questionnaires, completed in a physician's office, or via online questionnaires via something like a patient portal. And although all of these may constitute patient-reported data, to be used in quality measurement, the information has to be stored in the patient's medical record. Next slide. So when we talk about patient level or encounter level testing, we're actually referring to data element testing that's conducted after initial specifications during the testing phase. It's not actually specific to the patient-reported data type at all. In fact, we would expect patient or encounter level testing for almost all quality measures, but we're just including it here to make that distinction clear, just to kind of separate this out from other patient-related tools. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's transition away from the patient-related terminology and onto some more specification-related terms, and here specifically related to level of analysis and accountable entities. Next slide. So these two terms are sometimes conflated, so I'll aim to untangle their definitions here a bit. Level of analysis, I hope somewhat intuitively, refers to how the measure score is to be calculated and reported, specifically as it relates to the tier of the healthcare system being measured. So this ties into attribution. So a facility level measure, for example, is one that is attributed at the facility level. So for example, at the hospital level. So the level of analysis would indicate that performance should be calculated for that facility overall, rather than at the individual clinician level, for example. The accountable entity, on the other hand, refers to the specific facility or entity that reports on the measure itself and receives performance scores on said measure. And it's important to note that a given accountable entity may be responsible for reporting on measures at varying levels of analysis, especially if it's a large health system that may be reporting on, clinician or practice level measures for some of their facilities, and then at hospital level measures or system level measures for other programs. Next slide. All right. Now we're going to move on to exceptions versus exclusions. And this is often a challenging distinction to those who are new to measurement. So we'll just spend a few minutes here. Next slide, please. So when measure developers define the denominator and the numerator, exclusions and exceptions should be included in those definitions. Exclusions and exceptions are very important in quality measurement because they help to ensure measure validity by providing a mechanism to make measure calculations more reflective of the reality of care quality. And while the terms are similar, there are some important nuances and differences that impact how each of these operates within technical specifications. Next slide. So starting with exclusions, these are cases that need to be removed prior to calculating the measure score. And you're more likely to find measures that include denominator exclusions, which are cases that need to be removed from the denominator before determining whether the numerator criteria are met. So in the measure algorithm, patients who meet the exclusion criteria would be removed from the denominator straight away, regardless of whether or not they would have met the numerator or not. Numerator exclusions refer to cases that are not included in the numerator data, even if they might meet the denominator criteria. They add a little bit of complexity to measure specifications, but can be really important in specific cases. So for example, the PSI-03 measure includes a numerator exclusion for patients who present on admission for an adverse event, in this case for a pressure ulcer, where the patient remains at risk for an in-hospital adverse event down the line. Next slide, please. So some measures include something called an exception, or more specifically, a denominator exception, which, while similar to an exclusion, refers specifically to cases that should be removed from the denominator only if the numerator criteria are not met. This is often used to account for things like patient refusals in instances where, for example, a denominator qualifying patient refuses a recommended screening or vaccination, then they would be an exception from that measure, which helps to ensure that providers are not penalized for something outside of their control. Next slide. Okay, turning finally to digital quality measures, I'll give you the sort of latest CMS definition along with some additional context before I transition us to a little bit of a discussion about reconciling differences in data definitions across sources. Next slide. So as of last spring, CMS has defined digital quality measures, or DQMs, as written here. So they are quality measures organized as self-contained measure specifications and code packages that use one or more sources of health information that's captured and can be transmitted electronically via interoperable systems. Data sources for DQMs can include administrative systems, electronically submitted clinical assessment data, case management systems, EHRs, lab systems, prescription drug monitoring programs or PDMPs, instruments like medical devices and wearable devices, patient portals or other applications, health information exchanges or registries, for example. And the thinking is that digital quality measures improve patient experience overall by promoting improved care quality and population health while also reducing overall costs. Over the summer, we held a public webinar about the CMS Digital Quality Measurement Blueprint, and that's posted on the CMS YouTube page and may be a helpful starting point for those interested in learning a little bit more about the future directions related to DQM use. Next slide, please. It's important to note that the aforementioned definition includes measures that use one or more sources of electronically transmissible data, meaning that hybrid measures technically meet the definition of a DQM, at least currently. And then further, I think electronic clinical quality measures, or ECQMs, are a topic that most people are familiar with. And they're really just one example of a DQM, but they are not actually synonymous. The DQM definition is much broader than the ECQM definition and includes top categories such as claims measures, for example. Next slide, please. So perhaps calling this slide Approaching Differences is in reality more of a bit of a plug for the MMS Hub, but we really do encourage folks to visit the MMS Hub, which incorporates all of the information previously included in the MMS Blueprint, for the most up-to-date information about CMS accepted terminology and best practices for measure development. The hub is updated quarterly, and that's with input directly from CMS and key stakeholders. And as a result, it's a trusted source for current information about CMS quality measurement. And I think the link to the hub has been shared in the chat and will be again. Thank you. And with that, we can go to the next slide. So jumping over to key takeaways today, I know this was a little bit of a short one, but quality measurement relies on precise language, and our ability to collaborate across stakeholders to achieve measurement and performance goals is really dependent on consistent use of standardized language and unambiguous measure specifications. CMS contracts with Battelle, who, as the MMS contractor, maintains the MMS Hub, where up-to-date information about standards and processes is held, which is just one of many ways that CMS is trying to, continually standardize and improve on these processes. And with that next slide, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Kate to talk us through some polling.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Brenna. So one of the things that we are going to do before we get into our Q&A section is to kind of ask to hear from you. One of the wonderful things about the info sessions is that we rely on our audience and our stakeholders to help inform us what's of interest to you. You will see a poll pop up that will ask, these are two topics that have come up in conversation. They are a session on health equity accreditation or a session on information on ways to develop equity measures. So these are two topics that we've heard could be of interest for members of the stakeholder engagement community. So we would like to hear if this is things that you would like to learn about. So you should have just popped up. And if you are interested in one or other, please just click on it, and we strongly encourage you to do so. While we are getting there, also wanted to note that we have received several questions, really grateful for that, and that we are going to be moving to the Q&A portion shortly. But but that if there are questions that we are unable to answer, we will follow up. So that's just an FYI. So we may not be able to get to every question asked. It may be something that we need additional input on, and we will follow up with people. So with that, I'm actually going to open it up for questions. And Brenna, it looks like we have a question that came in on CQM. So the question is, how different are technical specifications for ECQMs or other digital quality measures compared to non-electronic measures?
Yeah, thank you. So the data source for ECQMs in particular, right, is electronic health record data, typically. It's definitely electronic data. It's usually from the EHR. And the goal in an ECQM is sort of the machine-to-machine transfer of data. So meaning that there's no really manual intervention in terms of how the data is stored or collected or calculated. So conceptually, technical specification development is the same across all measure types. So being able to clearly define data elements and the relationships between those data elements is the same, but to develop an ECQM, the specifications require the use of a suite of tools that enable the creation of both human and machine readable files. So both the MMS Hub and the ECQI Resource Center are great resources for learning more about the specifics for how to do that. Regarding other digital quality measures, I think the same generally applies. Any electronic components, any data elements that need to be transmitted electronically are going to have a machine readable component and a sort of an awareness of how data elements are coded in that way.
Excellent. And this is a follow-up question. So where would you recommend people look for digital quality measures if they'd like to see an example of one? I know you referenced the ECQI Resource Center, but wanted to know if there were additional places where people could find digital quality measures.
Yeah, well, the ECQI Resource Center, absolutely, for ECQMs that are being used in programs. But the other option I would say would be on the CMS measures inventory. So the CMIT is where you can find all of the quality measures that are being used in CMS programs, and folks can kind of filter for digital quality measures to see what those look like.
Wonderful. And we are actually going to put a link to CMIT in the chat so that the people can reference it. So the next question we have is, can you explain how measure developers can harmonize measures? What do they look for?
Sure. Yeah, so I mentioned harmonization, but I sort of breezed over it at the beginning of the presentation. But harmonization is sort of in its most colloquial. It's an effort that reduces the likelihood that measure developers are reinventing the wheel. So the goal is to leverage work that's already been done for other measures. So maybe related to how the target population is defined or how a specific condition is defined using an established value set, to reduce the burden, both in terms of actually developing the measure specifications, but also the burden associated with reporting on those measures. The more similar a measure, like different measures across programs define certain conditions or populations, the less work that technical staff at the reporting entities will have to do to get those implemented in their systems.
Excellent. The next question we got was about if there was a list of CQMs under development, and it was in reference to the measures under consideration list that are waiting for rulemaking.
Yes. So I suppose the specifics of the question I could maybe turn over to you, Kate. You probably know the status of the MUC list measures better than I do at this point. But if the question is about measures under development, there's not a formal, publicly shared measures under development list, but when measures are put on the MUC list, usually December of each year is when that final MUC list is published. But if there's anything that anybody else on the line wants to add to that,
Absolutely. Yeah, so actually, so for the 2022 MUC list, the review meetings are currently occurring, and at the end of the month, CMS Merit, which is the tool that measure developers can use to submit measures they would like to for consideration on the measures under consideration list, is going to open at the end of the month. That list is made public by December 1st of every year. So on December 1st of each year, you'll be able to see the list of measures that are under consideration for CMS rulemaking. And it will include information about measure type, such as ECQM. So that is currently happening right now, and the next cycle is about to open.
Thanks, Kate.
And then let's see. So next question we have is, how does standard terminologies in health IT like SNOMED or LOINC fit into this whole conversation we've been having about terminology and measure specification?
Yeah, yep. Super fair question, and probably a topic we could spend an entire info session talking about, and maybe should. But health IT standards like SNOMED and LOINC, I'm sure whoever asked this question already knows this, but I guess, level set for the audience. They make it so that we can represent and communicate about concepts in sort of a standard, unambiguous way. So most communication between health information systems or used in ECQMs relies on structured vocabularies, terminologies, code sets, classification systems, things like SNOMED and LOINC to represent the health concepts when a manual abstractor isn't involved. So those types of standards or terminologies are often what get used in defining the data elements that make up an ECQM or other digital quality measures that have an electronic health record component.
Okay, excellent. And in looking through our questions, and it looks like we are about out. There are a couple that we're going to follow up on, but it looks like we've had a really rich discussion. So I think we can move it on to our announcements. Okay, so a couple of really exciting events we have coming up. Our next info session is February 22nd from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern. And kind of really tying in quite nicely to this presentation we just had. It's going to be on digital quality measure specification. And we will be fortunate to hear from Mathematica, who is a measure developer that works on helping move ECQMs into DQMs. So that's going to be really wonderful. The link to register will be in the webinar chat. So it is right there. And we really hope that you're able to join us. If you are unable to join us, have no fear. We will be posting the slides as well as the recording on the MMS Hub. So that is one of our events that's coming up. And then if we move on to the next slide, we have our public webinars. So biannually, CMS holds public webinars to really talk about some large-scale strategic issues that are happening within the healthcare measurement field. We're having our first set of public webinars on February 28th and March 8th. They will be on health equity, so it's from data to action, how CMS and its stakeholders are addressing inequities in healthcare. During the presentation, we are going to review the CMS equity framework, as well as hear from a couple of people in the field who are doing work that is moving forward on addressing healthcare inequities. So we'll be hearing from the Gravity Project as well as RAND Corporation. So we're very excited about that. You will see the 2 registration links have popped in to the chat. These will be the same session held twice, so you do not have to register for both. We are just holding them twice in order to maximize the opportunity that people will be able to join us live. So we highly encourage you to register for the public webinars, as well as sending along to your colleagues who you think would be very interested in this. And We have the 2 instances of the same session. So one will be on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. The other one will be on a Wednesday at noon Eastern, trying to make sure that we can catch both coasts as well as fit into people's busy schedules. Really looking forward to it. So let's see if we move on to the next slide. Okay, and here we have contact information. So you can see the MMS email is here, as well as our CMS lead, Angela Wright. Her email is on here as well. We thank you so much for joining us, and we will be posting on MMS Hub the recording of this probably within the next 2 weeks. So if you receive the MMS newsletter, you will be receiving a link saying that it's been posted, and always encourage you to go and check on MMS Hub for what's up to date and happening on within the measures management system. So I want to thank Brenna for presenting, and I want to thank all of you for taking your time today to join us, and hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.